Thanks to Eleanor being gone, we can play this freely. We should thank Eleanor, my son said. Yeah, thanks for being gone, Eleanor, chimed in the other. Hearing these words, I realized something. They were the exact words written on the photo in the coffin of my son's wife. Could it be that the awful prank was actually done by my son? As this thought dawned on me, I couldn't help but suspect my son. After seeing the two off for their day out, I decided to search my daughter-in-law's room for any clues. There was no doubt that my daughter-in-law's death was an accident, but I couldn't accept their attitude. I kept thinking there might have been something more to it. Relying on a mother's intuition, I desperately searched. In her modest room, which reflected her personality, I found a diary. Sorry for reading this without permission, Eleanor, I whispered to myself as I turned the pages. I read through the diary, anxiously looking for anything that could lead to the truth. What I found far exceeded my expectations. A series of terrible events. You're kidding. Not just Charles, but my husband, too, was involved in such things? The diary revealed a series of horrifying misdeeds by my son and husband against my daughter-in-law, about which I knew nothing. Rather than remorse, their attitude seemed to worsen, and I decided to take revenge. I'm Hannah. I turned 62 this year. I live with my son and his wife, and I thought we got along reasonably well. But that changed suddenly. One day, my son's wife, Eleanor, died in a car accident. Eleanor, my only daughter-in-law, was as dear to me as my own child. Having lost her parents early, she treated me like her real mother. Despite being timid, she was caring and kinder than my son, and I dare say I loved her more. Losing such a beloved daughter-in-law left me in deep despair for a while. Mom, we need to prepare for Eleanor's funeral, so please pull yourself together, my son urged. Yes, I need to be strong. Eleanor wouldn't rest in peace otherwise. Pushed by my son, I finally faced the reality of Eleanor's accident and started dealing with the arrangements. I was too distressed to notice why my son seemed so unaffected. On the day of the funeral, I cried until my eyes were swollen red. My daughter-in-law was a hard worker, diligently employed at a company owned by my relatives. She was a kind and thoughtful girl, as I often heard, and her funeral was mourned by many relatives. I'm truly grateful for everything. Thank you for becoming my daughter, I said, bidding farewell to the coffin when a photo inside caught my attention. It was a family photo taken during a trip, presumably placed there by someone with good intentions. However, strangely, my daughter-in-law, who should have been in the picture, was missing. It wasn't that she wasn't in the original photo. Rather, she was cut out from where she should have been. Puzzled, I turned the photo over and saw a handwritten note. Thanks for being gone. Shocked by these horrifying words, I screamed and collapsed on the spot. Mom, what's wrong? This. I showed the photo to my son, pale-faced. He looked surprised, but quickly dismissed it, saying, It's just a prank, and tucked the photo into his pocket before returning to his seat. Unable to believe his reaction, I called out to him loudly, How can you just call this a prank? It's outrageous to do something like this here. Let's be quiet until the funeral is over. We can talk later. How can I be calm knowing that someone capable of doing this might be here? It's unfair to Eleanor. I pleaded desperately with my son, but he shook his head, unwilling to engage in my concerns. He even seemed annoyed by my raising my voice in such a solemn setting. Fearing someone with malicious intent was among us, I fled the funeral home, intending to report to the police. Someone here has done something terrible. Please excuse her. My mom is just very confused, my son interjected. The police officers listened sympathetically but said it was impossible to determine who placed the photo. Even when I mentioned the car accident that took my daughter-in-law's life and the apprehended driver, they could only offer troubled looks, unable to pinpoint a suspect. Enough already, my husband chided. With all this commotion, Eleanor won't be able to rest in peace. That's right, Mom. Dad's right, my son added. Moreover, my son and husband, the very ones who should have been essential, began to say that I, who was making a fuss over just a prank, was an embarrassment. A gentle husband and son trying to calm me down, distraught over losing a beloved family member. To the police, they must have appeared as caring and sensible, but to me, their indifferent faces during such an appalling event at my dear family's funeral were far more terrifying. Why aren't you upset? This is a malicious prank. How can you be so calm? Crying and screaming about it won't make Eleanor happy, they replied. What's the point in finding the culprit anyway? Perhaps to the other funeral attendees it seemed like I was overreacting. Advised by other relatives to calm down, I quietly returned to my seat. Even at the family funeral, the lack of tears from the two of them made them seem suspicious to me. I managed to hold myself together during the ceremony, having promised to talk with them afterwards. It was important to properly send off my dear daughter-in-law. Clutching my handkerchief, I held on to that thought throughout the funeral. Once it was over and we were back home, we finally had the promised conversation. When I expressed my desire to find the culprit who put that photo there and to demand an apology for my daughter-in-law, they exchanged glances, shook their heads, and said something unbelievable. Maybe Eleanor just incurred someone's wrath. What did you say? It's just a prank. No need to get so worked up about it. There's nothing we can do for Eleanor now anyway. Laughing, they dismissed my concerns and left the room without another word. How could they be so cold? Considering she was so important to them too. I couldn't understand, and I was left with only disappointment in them. After the funeral, they didn't even join me in paying respects to my daughter-in-law's photo, calling it morbid. And they frowned, making things even worse. I began to wonder if one of the two of them had placed that photo. Such thoughts crossed my mind when they started doing something that seemed to confirm my suspicions. My husband, originally the one who was fond of gambling and other such pastimes, influenced my son, who also started going out frequently after the funeral. You seem to be enjoying yourselves, quite the lavish lifestyle lately. It's business as usual, but we've got some extra cash for fun now. Where did that come from? It's Eleanor's insurance money. My son said it nonchalantly, leaving me speechless. They were using the insurance money from a family member's death for leisure, an utterly heartless act. I was at a loss for words, unable to believe them. Ignoring my pale, silent shock, they continued, laughing. Thanks to Eleanor being gone now, we can play this freely. We should thank Eleanor. Yeah, thanks for being gone, Eleanor. Hearing this, I realized something. Those were the same words written on the back of the photo that I saw. Could it be that my son really did it? The suspicion towards him grew unbearable. After they left to enjoy themselves, I decided to search my daughter-in-law's room for any left-behind clues. Ever since the accident, my daughter-in-law's room has been left untouched. I looked around, searching for anything left behind, despite being repeatedly told by my son and husband to clean it up quickly. I just couldn't bring myself to do it right away, so I left it as it was. In her modest room, which reflected her personality, what I found was a diary. Sorry for reading this without permission, Eleanor. I apologized in my heart as I turned the pages. Anxiously, I read through it, looking for anything that could reveal the truth. What I found exceeded all my expectations, a series of terrible events. Can it be true? Not just Charles, but my husband as well? The diary detailed the harassment she suffered from both my husband and son. My husband had been harassing my son's wife in my absence, treating her almost like a servant. It turns out he even discussed these actions with my son, who not only failed to intervene but also joined in the mockery. In secret, away from prying eyes, they repeatedly tormented her, and she endured it silently. As detailed in her diary over several days, they raised a question in me. Why didn't you ever confide in me? I felt guilty for not noticing her distress, but it troubled me that she never sought my advice, despite regarding me as her own mother. I never heard any of this from her, making me wonder if I had missed her attempts to reach out. Then I came across a passage in her diary. I can't tell Hannah she's like my real mom. I don't want to upset her. Tears welled up in my eyes reading those words. My kind-hearted daughter-in-law, who surely never wronged anyone, couldn't have been the target of hatred. Later in her diary, she debated consulting me, but then the accident happened, taking her life. The thought of her unfulfilled life made my heart feel like it was tearing apart. I clutched the diary, resolving to avenge her. Before my husband and son returned, I made numerous phone calls. To avenge my daughter-in-law, I was ready to bring them down. Fortunately, her character had earned her many allies. Many agreed to help with my revenge. Each call felt like being possessed, urgently seeking assistance. Each time I could speak of her good deeds. "I'll help. I didn't know such things happened. Thank you," I replied, bowing my head even over the phone. Many shared my indignation towards those two. While it was gratifying, it also brought a great sense of regret. I wished I could have told my daughter-in-law how many allies she had. Holding on to my regret for not protecting her, I gathered my resolve. Once everything was in place for revenge, I summoned them to a certain location on a Sunday. It was a restaurant where I first showed my husband the divorce papers I'd filled out. "What? Why all of the sudden?" "It's not sudden. Don't you have any idea why?" "Is this about Eleanor?" I nodded and he sighed heavily. Dismissing it as trivial, he narrowed his eyes, but my determination was unshakable. "Eleanor died in a traffic accident. Why should I get divorced over that?" "Really, no idea? Reflect deeply on your own actions." "Mom, rethink this. There's no need to break up the family over this. You two are the ones who tore it apart. Charles, you too. Leave our house." I demanded my son, who had been acting as a mediator, also leave the house. Realizing his involvement too late, he began to panic. The house we lived in was paid for by my loans. I didn't want these two, who disregarded my beloved daughter, living there any longer. When they realized I was serious, they tried to appease me with jesting apologies. "We're sorry about the prank. If it's money you want, we can give you a share of the insurance money. We could ask the funeral attendees if that makes you feel better, Mom." "It's not about that," I replied, sighing at their off-target apologies. Could they truly have forgotten all they had done? To remind them, I placed my daughter-in-law's diary, which I had brought in my bag, on the table. Initially puzzled, they both turned pale as I began reading aloud. "What's that? Why do you have it?" "It's Eleanor's diary. It seems you both were quite cruel to her when I wasn't looking." "Cruel? We were just being a family." "Treating her like a servant in the house, and that's being a family?" "Yeah, we were. What's wrong with that?" "I was just teaching Eleanor, who had no parents, how to be dutiful." My husband was the first to show his true colors, unabashedly justifying their treatment of her as teaching her dutifulness. For the first time, I felt the urge to slap his detestable face. My son, flustered by the exposure of the truth, finally admitted he had followed his father's lead. His excuses implying fault on my daughter-in-law's part only deepened my disappointment. Inwardly, I apologized to her, realizing they never considered her family. See, Eleanor was better at work than me, and that annoyed me. She couldn't even uphold her husband's honor. She was just a daughter who lacked parental guidance. Even after the funeral, she continues to be undutiful. She wasn't your daughter. She was only my daughter. What are you talking about, Mom? I'm your only child. You're no longer my family. Both of you, leave my house now. To me, my real family was only my daughter-in-law. I couldn't consider these two remorseless people as family anymore. As I stood firm, they became defiant, thinking they could intimidate me in a 2-to-1 situation. Are you going to kick out your own family for someone who's no longer here? You took her place away first. I stood my ground, shouting back and not flinching, even as my husband banged on the table and yelled. Frustrated by my resistance, my son reached for the diary in my arms. Stopping him was the president of the company where my daughter-in-law had worked. "President, why are you here?" "I heard about it from Hannah. It seems you've been treating one of our valued employees terribly." Seeing the person who intervened just in time, I felt a wave of relief. Actually, I had arranged for the president and colleagues who knew my daughter-in-law to attend this meeting secretly. Seeing his seniors and juniors approach from behind, my son looked visibly shaken. I only intended to observe, but seeing no remorse, I felt compelled to intervene. "It's not my fault. Dad was the one leading the way in mistreating her. Yet you didn't help her. You thought she was getting too confident because she was good at her job? Well, that's... A worker with no people skills is of no use to our company." Realizing they were outnumbered, the two collapsed on the spot. They begged for my forgiveness. Too late, and I shook my head. "The one you should be apologizing to is different," I said. "But you found it gloomy to even pay respects, right? I'm sure Eleanor wouldn't want to see your faces now." With that, I left them behind. Seeing their dejected faces, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Afterward, I got the divorce papers signed, and my husband and I became strangers. But my ex-husband and son, still trying to stay in this house, were promptly moved out by movers I hired. They now live in a small, cheap apartment, managing somehow together. The president, who had been fond of my daughter-in-law, deeply apologized for not noticing her situation, and was quite indignant at my son's behavior towards her, resulting in his termination. He still lingers there part-time, but with a cold shoulder from his informed colleagues. As for my ex-husband, it seems he squandered most of his savings on horse racing and often came to me for money. I learned he was frequently scolded by my for his spending habits. Despite being in a dire financial situation, he would beg for money to continue his only enjoyment, horse racing. Fed up with his unrepentant attitude, "I'll call the police if you come again," I warned. "Apologize to Eleanor. It won't be forgiven, but it's the least you can do." "I am sorry, so lend me some money." "If you're truly sorry, why not find a part-time job to help your son? Without him, you're nothing." I slammed the door in his face. He pounded on the door for a while, blaming my daughter-in-law, but eventually left. In the quiet living room, I paid my respects to my daughter-in-law. I often wonder and regret if I could have done something sooner as a mother. The photo I found in her coffin, which my son and husband denied knowing about, might have been a message from her. I can't do anything for her now, but I hope reporting how things ended up with those two gives her some peace as I look at the picture of my dear daughter.